All right. Welcome back to Paradigm Sherpas, everybody. Today's episode, we are taking a glimpse into the methodically researched book by Kevin Roberts Ryan titled Another 19, Investigating Legitimate 9/11 Suspects. Now, Ryan's book proposes an alternative theory about who committed the crime of the millennium. And he suggests that any book that does that should be more easily believable and offer stronger evidence to support those beliefs than the official story. So, Kevin, I'm with you in that regard. If you're going to offer an alternative perspective, it should probably make more sense intuitively and then have better facts to support those claims. But who is Kevin Ryan and why should we care about his book? Well, Kevin Ryan worked at Underwriters Laboratory, which was the organization responsible for testing and certifying the fireproofing of the steel within the World Trade Center. Now, Kevin asked some questions about 9/11 to the investigatory body, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and for pushing back on their theories, Kevin lost his job in retaliation. Now, Kevin's book has received the blessing from numerous family members of 9/11 victims, including members of the Family Steering Committee for the 9/11 Commission, sort of people that were key representatives to the 9/11 Commission on behalf of victims' families. And he's also got the support of prominent researchers like David Ray Griffin, Graham McQueen, and Peter Dale Scott. So, the goal of today's book review is, of course, to just give you a peek into the book. We're not going to go through the whole thing. And I hope that you'll take the time yourself to go read it and draw your own conclusions. So, what does Ryan say happened on 9/11? Well, first of all, he suggests that 9/11 was a deep event. And what Professor Peter Dale Scott says about deep events is that they are covert occurrences that facilitate the strategies of the wealthy elite. And often these events are systematically ignored or falsified in the mainstream media and public consciousness. So basically, another way of saying this is that there's a group of wealthy people, and often we may not know that these people are connected, and they have something that they want to accomplish. So they, sub rosa execute an operation, and then through the media, there's a bunch of either misinformation, disinformation, false stories told about the narrative, or it's just completely ignored in attempts to suppress it from the public consciousness. And so Ryan suggests that 9/11 is no different. Well, he adds that it's a constitutional deep event and that it's a deep event that subverted the Constitution of the United States. But if you're struggling to grasp a deep event, it might suggest you consider the Kennedy assassination as a deep event. Basically, the government said that JFK was assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald, a lone nut gunman. And now, after a number of years, it's more accepted that Oswald likely wasn't the assassin, or at a minimum, he wasn't working alone, and that there were powerful interests that wanted to see Kennedy dead. It wasn't just some rogue guy who wanted to kill the president. So, uh, Kevin thinks that 9/11 is this deep event. Well, why would he think that? I guess let's first look at a couple quick plot holes in the official narrative. In my mind, they're innumerable. Kevin's book does a great job of pointing a lot of them out, but I'll just cover like a couple that have always stood out to me. First, the planes that hit the Twin Towers. It's said that the uh, indestructible black box flight recorders were never recovered because they were destroyed either in the initial impact and the fireball that ensued or in the collapse. But either way, according to the 9/11 Commission report, they were never recovered. What's so crazy about that comment is that we're meant to believe that one of the hijackers' passports was found completely intact outside the World Trade Center. So, like a paper passport was found on the ground completely intact, and it allegedly belonged to one of the alleged hijackers. So big red flag right there for me. That's always stood out. Another one that's huge for most people is the fact that, you know, three buildings collapsed on 9/11 in New York City, both the Twin Towers and then a third building called World Trade Center 7. Now, World Trade Center 7 was not hit by an airplane on 9/11, but it collapsed at free fall speed symmetrically into its own footprint. Um, that's never happened before 9/11, and it's never happened since. And World Trade Center 7 isn't just some tiny, rinky-dink building. It was 47 stories tall. It would be the tallest building in 33 of the 50 United States. So pretty unbelievable history there. A few more key loopholes, and then we'll dig more into the whodunit in Kevin's book. Another thing that blows a lot of people's minds, including mine, is that this guy right here, Hani Hanjour, was deemed too incompetent to even fly a Cessna by the guy who was, trying to give him flight lessons leading up to 9/11. But somehow we're supposed to believe that Hani Hanjour, while not being able to fly a Cessna, could execute a complex corkscrew turn with a 747 smashing it into the side of the Pentagon. Also, kind of interesting about the Pentagon is that we have no videos, even though it's one of the most heavily surveilled buildings on Earth, no videos showing the plane smashing into the side of the wall that day. Now, the story goes on here, right? The Bush administration fought tooth and nail to prevent the creation of the 9/11 Commission. Don't take my word for it. There's plenty of corroboration from the family members. Now, members of the 9/11 Commission are on record saying that it was set up to fail from the beginning. Interestingly, Commission member Philip Zelikow wrote the outline of the final report before the investigation even started, and repeatedly throughout trying publishing the final report, he tried to link 9/11 to Iraq and was only stopped by staffers who said they were going to go to the press and make a big fuss. Zelikow did go on the record, I believe, at University of Virginia a year or two later, saying that the Iraq War was started on behalf of Israel, but it wasn't a very popular sell for the American people. What else? The 9/11 Commission received less than 10% of the funding that the Clinton Monica Lewinsky sex scandal investigation received. And this is probably the most important. The 9/11 Commission failed to answer 70% of the questions provided by the 9/11 families. Now, side note, if you want to learn more about what I think is the fraudulent 9/11 Commission, go read or listen to The Commission by Philip Shannon. Okay, so Ryan basically suggests in the book that it was functionally impossible for 19 outsiders. Sorry, you can only see some of them, but these are some of the alleged 19 hijackers. Ryan's basically saying it's impossible for these outsiders to shut down U.S. air defenses for 2 hours. Instead, he suggests that a network of corporate and government insiders were the only people that, one, had the capability to do something like that, but then two, had the incentive to do something like that. So now, without further ado, we're going to take a look at four people that Ryan says deserve further scrutiny as legitimate suspects in 9/11, as opposed to, the official narrative that says these guys did it. Okay. Whoop. All right. So the first guy, Donald Rumsfeld, he was Secretary of Defense on 9/11. Look, I'm just going to give you a brief history of Rumsfeld and a tidbit about what he was doing on 9/11. I'm not trying to go through all the evidence that Ryan provides in the book. It's just who was he, and give, I'll share something shady about it again, and I'll do that for everybody. Go read the book. This is just like get your mind thinking. So. Rumsfeld was a Princeton guy. While at Princeton, he wrote a thesis about why you should expand presidential power. He was roommates with another guy we're going to talk about here, former deputy CIA director Frank Carlucci. But Rumsfeld was in government for a long time. He was a congressman from Illinois for a number of years. He went on to work for Nixon. After Nixon resigned, he served as chief of staff for Gerald Ford. He's appointed as the youngest Secretary of Defense ever by Ford. In the 80s, he goes over to the Middle East to buddy up with Saddam Hussein, basically give him the green light to use chemical weapons in the war against Iran. Eventually, he stabs Saddam in the back by, publishing a letter with the project for the new American century, suggesting that we need to do some regime change in Iraq. I think that came out in 1998. Um, but all right, so he leaves government. He's in government for decades, basically, and he leaves government in the 80s to go be the chairman of the Rand Corporation, which is an elite military think tank, responsible for coming up with a lot of Washington policy. And he's also the chairman of the board of Solomon Smith Barney. And Solomon Smith Barney is important because they occupied all but 10 floors of World Trade Center 7 that collapsed on 9/11. So, Rumsfeld's the chairman of the board there for like a decade leading up to 9/11. Bush wins the presidency, brings Rumsfeld on board. Rumsfeld resigns early 2001. Now, fast forward to the events of 9/11. So, the day before 9/11, Rumsfeld greets the press and says that $2.3 trillion can't be accounted for within the Pentagon. And on the next day, this Pearl Harbor like attack happens. Now, Rumsfeld is one of the founding members of that project for the new American century that I just mentioned. And in their, original paper, they said that, America's not going to maintain world dominance unless there is a new Pearl Harbor like event that catalyzes us to revamp our military. And, lo and behold, right after he gets into office, a few years after publishing that paper, we have this new Pearl Harbor like event. And the worst thing about Rumsfeld on 9/11 is that he's the Secretary of Defense. He's responsible for, enacting all the protocols that are going to keep us safe when we're under attack. And what does he do once the Pentagon's attacked? Well, he goes and wanders around outside for 30 minutes. Now, you would think this guy's like, oh, I got to go get to work. He's not some new kid on the block. He's been in these kind of roles his whole life. He's been Secretary of Defense before. But instead of taking action to enact the protocols to keep us safe, he goes out into the parking lot and wanders along, around the lawn, and he's unreachable by any of the people who you would expect to reach out to him for direction on what we should be doing to keep people safe and stop these attacks. So I'll just leave it at that, but that's a high level background on Rumsfeld and what he was doing on 9/11. So let's pivot over to somebody else. Well, this is Rumsfeld's buddy, Dick Cheney. Dick Cheney was vice president on 9/11, but Dick and Don go back, many years. In fact, it was Rumsfeld who brought Cheney into the fold in the Nixon administration. They worked together in the Nixon administration. Cheney went on to, work in the Ford administration as well, just like Rumsfeld. He was Ford's. He was actually the youngest chief of staff ever. He was 34 years old when he became President Ford's chief of staff. Now, Cheney's interesting in that he was deeply involved, just like Rumsfeld and a few other people we're going to mention, in something called the continuity of government effort. Now, this really gained momentum through the 80s, but the short of it is that it was this program that was put in place to ensure that if there was like nuclear holocaust, that the government could keep running, or if like the chain of command was killed, how would the government keep functioning? How would America still be America? So Cheney was one of the key guys that helped plan, building the underground bunkers, creating these independent communication tools, and putting in the procedures of, hey, if a nuclear bomb goes off, what are we going to do, and how do we take control of the country? And so that comes into play on the events of 9/11. This is the first time that these protocols are actually enacted, and they suspend the Constitution of the United States and create an alternative power structure. And just before 9/11, the language of the continuity of government protocols was slightly changed to say that, it doesn't just have to be a nuclear attack. It could be just a terrorist attack to you know, put in this alternate governance system. Now, a little bit more on Cheney's background, and then we'll get into what he was doing on 9/11. So, Cheney also worked for George H.W. Bush. He, was very involved in the Gulf War. Uh, After working for H.W. Bush, he has a long stint working as the CEO of Halliburton, a massive oil company. He's there from 94 to 2000, doing illegal things like, working with Iran. We were banned, American companies were banned from working with Iran. Cheney found a way around it to make hundreds of millions for Halliburton and, tens of millions for himself. Comes back into the government in 2001 as George W. Bush's vice president. And shortly after taking office, he leads a secret national energy policy development group. And this group held undocumented meetings with oil and gas representatives talking about how they were going to divvy up Iraq's oil reserves. Now, this is even before 9/11, let alone the invasion of Iraq. But Cheney gets into office in 2001, starts meeting with oil execs, how they're going to slice and dice oil in Iraq. And he fought the Government Accountability Office that, keeps these records of these meetings tooth and nail from that ever becoming public. Now, I'm not going to get into all the shady things Cheney did on 9/11. I'll just point out one of the things that I thought was most noticeable. And this was testimony from then Secretary of Transportation Norman Mineta. He testified to Congress that he was in the Presidential Emergency Operations Center with Cheney. Cheney was essentially assumed command of the country after the attack started. And Mineta observed that Cheney was repeatedly approached by staff in the office saying, "Hey, sir, do the orders still stand?" Now, the suggestion was that Flight 77 that crashed in the Pentagon was being tracked for a while, and this guy's basically saying, "Hey, Mr. Vice President, we see this object coming towards the Pentagon. We need to do something about it. Do the orders still stand to let it keep going?" And Cheney freaks out and says, like, "Who the hell do you think you are? No one's told you that the orders have changed, right? Right. So shut up. The orders stand." And Mineta is like, "I can't believe this. They know an object's coming towards the Pentagon and he's not going to do anything about it." That's not me. That's the Secretary of Transportation, Norman Mineta, and what he testified to Congress about Dick Cheney's actions on 9/11. So that's a lot of background on Cheney. Again, the chapter in the book goes into a lot more detail, but that's just a little bit of a high level look. Let's go on. We've got two more people here. The next guy is Frank Carlucci. Carlucci was a highly influential guy. He's got close ties to both Rumsfeld and Cheney, but in particularly Rumsfeld. Carlucci and Rumsfeld were roommates together at Princeton. Rumsfeld brought Carlucci into the government, much like he did with Cheney. Got him his first job at the Office of Economic Opportunity. Carlucci goes on to do a lot of things working under Nixon and Ford. Then he goes into covert operations in the 70s. He becomes deputy director of the CIA under Carter. He works with these infamous deep state operatives like Ted Shackley, also George H.W. Bush, who was, a director of the CIA. And Carlucci works on things like funding the Mujahideen, these Afghan fighters who go on to become Al Qaeda. U.S. government gave them millions and millions of dollars through Saudi Arabia, the bank BCCI, a very corrupt bank out of Pakistan. And basically, they tried to fund these guys to take on the Russians in Afghanistan, but eventually this group became Al Qaeda. So Carlucci was intimately involved with lifting up that group in Afghanistan. He would leave the government to go work for what's called Spook Central, Sears World Trade. It was a private company that was uh, worked on consulting, selling military equipment, and it was likely, excuse me, involved in coordinating the illegal arms sales in the Iran-Contra scandal. And after participating with Sears World Trade, Carlucci goes to work for Ronald Reagan, and he works as his national security advisor and secretary of defense. Now, after his time with Reagan, he gets out of the government, and you can see this is a reoccurring theme. These guys bounce in and out of the government like a revolving door. In the decades leading, for the 12 years actually leading up to 9/11, Carlucci is the chairman of the Carlyle Group. The Carlyle Group is a private equity organization, a massive investment firm with deep ties to both the Bush family as well as the Saudi Arabian oil industry, and in particular, the bin Laden family. Now, how can this be? How many of us knew on September 11th that the Bush family has an intimate financial relationship with the bin Laden family of Saudi Arabia? Well, I would encourage everybody to consider exploring a couple books if they want to learn more about the Bush family and their intimate relationship with Saudi Arabia and the bin Ladens. Go check out Craig Unger's book, House of Bush and Saud, and then also check out Family of Secrets by Russ Baker. Now, besides Carlucci meeting with Osama bin Laden's brother in the Carlyle Group on 9/11, I think it's worth pointing out that the day after 9/11, President George Bush was said to be smoking cigars at the White House with Saudi Prince Bandar. If you read those books, you'll learn a lot about Saudi Prince Bandar. But the thought I'm going to convey here is that Saudi Prince Bandar's wife was found to have financed through a liaison two of the alleged 9/11 hijackers leading up to 9/11 while they were living in the United States. Pretty damning. All right. I lied. We have two more now. So Richard Armitage. Richard Armitage has a very similar background to all the guys I just mentioned. He was involved in covert operations in the 70s, drug smuggling, weapons smuggling, assassinations. Um, also was a part of arming the Mujahideen. Worked in the DOD under Carlucci for a number of years. He was accused of lying when testifying in the Iran-Contra scandal. Uh, he was another signatory of the Project for a New American Century, advocating for regime change in Iraq. And his most notable role is serving as the Deputy Secretary of State in overseeing the Express Visa program that allowed five of the alleged hijackers into the United States. Now, this was done without verifying their identities. There's another book I'd suggest. A guy, Michael Springman, wrote Visas for Al Qaeda. Springman worked at the U.S. consulate in Jeddah in Saudi Arabia, waved the red flag about these guys and said, no friggin' way should they get visas into the U.S. And someone came from over top, likely Armitage, and said, give those guys a visa right now. They're getting into the country. Now, Armitage is really shady as well because on 9/11, he was meeting with General Mahmoud Ahmed, the head of the Pakistani ISI. who was alleged to have provided over $100,000 to the alleged hijackers. And then, Armitage after 9/11 goes on to work for a company that made a lot of money selling the technology that uh, provided DNA testing to identify the victims' bodies in the 9/11 attacks. So, heavily involved in getting the alleged terrorists within the United States and made a lot of money after the fact. Now, the last person I'll mention here is a guy named Louis Freeh. He was the director of the FBI for 8 years, so he served under Clinton administration as well as Bush administration. He leaves the FBI right before 9/11 in June of 2001, but he is notified numerous times about people coming to the United States, trying to learn how to fly planes poorly, and mentioning, wanting to crash them into buildings. And he basically repeatedly ignores all this information coming from his field agents. And he also suppresses the fact that uh, the 9/11 hijackers were living with an FBI informant, and that informant was basically paid after 9/11, so, like a lot of money, I think over $100,000 to shut up and never talk about, how he lived. He was an informant who lived with the alleged hijackers. Now, Free after 9/11 goes on to join another one of Kevin Ryan's suspects, CIA Director George Tenet, on the board of a company that was flagged for insider trading, making a lot of profits on 9/11. The SEC flagged this company and said they had shady transactions that, suggested they knew something about 9/11 prior to it happening. And then it gets even crazier where Free goes on to become the personal attorney for Prince Bandar, the same Prince Bandar with the lifelong connection to the Bush family, whose wife was funding two of the suspected 9/11 hijackers uh, leading up to the events while they were living in the United States. So that's all I'm going to tell you in terms of, some key people with some questionable activities leading up to 9/11. There's a lot more here. Kevin enlightens us to a guy named Barry McDaniel, who is the leader of a security company called Stratesec. They were responsible for security at Dulles Airport. The video cameras. They were responsible for security at the World Trade Center. Interestingly enough, a board member of Stratesec was Marvin Bush, George Bush's brother. Um, there's a lot of things uncovered here about Rudy Giuliani, who was, everybody loved Rudy during 9/11. They called him America's mayor. A lot of questionable actions by Rudy, including putting his command center in World Trade Center 7, the building that collapsed without being hit by a plane, even though it was highly advised not to do that after the 1993 bombings. Um, and then finally, one other guy I'll mention again, like there's a bunch of other people here, but I found interesting the segment on Michael Canavan. He was the FAA hijack coordinator, who was nowhere to be found on 9/11, and he was a former JSOC commander. Really interesting background why this guy would be in this role, and then why he wasn't around to do the job he was hired for, uh, helping execute protocols related to counteracting hijackings. He was, I think, like in Puerto Rico, unreachable the morning of 9/11. So, again, point here wasn't to tell you all the key details about these people and why there's evidence to suggest they were working together and part of the 9/11 plot. Just pointing out a few key things that are suspect in hopes that you'll go read the book. Now, I'll close things up here with a few thoughts. So let me just change the slide. Sorry about that. So, little review here. We've got Donald Rumsfeld. He was intimately involved in continuity of government planning for a number of years. co-founder of Project for a New American Century, the group that said we need a new Pearl Harbor to establish American dominance for the next century. He's Secretary of Defense on 9/11, and um, instead of taking control of our response, he walks around the outside of the Pentagon for a half hour. He's missing in action when the world needs him most. Dick Cheney, similar deal, continuity of government planner for a number of years. He actually enacted continuity of government for the first time ever on 9/11. His company, Halliburton, made so much money in the post 9/11 world, part of the whole nation building efforts in Iraq and Afghanistan. Um, on 9/11, Norman Mineta, the Secretary of Transportation, testifies that Cheney maintained a stand down order even though they knew Flight 77 was coming towards them and had plenty of time to do something about it. Frank Carlucci, CIA guy, intimately involved with the Department of Defense, goes on to chair the Carlyle Group. He's meeting with the bin Laden family and other wealthy investors in the Carlyle Group the morning of 9/11. George H.W. Bush was actually at the Carlyle event the day before. So, there's this long history of the bin Laden Bush Saudi connection that most people aren't aware of. Richard Armitage, just remember that he, basically facilitated and allowed the alleged hijackers to get their visas to get into the country, even though the guy at the consulate was smart enough to say this is a terrible idea. These guys should not get visas. Again, that was Michael Springman. He wrote a book, Visas for Al Qaeda. And then Louis Freeh. Louis Freeh was a long-standing serving FBI director. He was there for the Oklahoma City bombing, Waco, TWA 800, all questionable stories and activities by the government. He suppresses information about the hijackers from the field leading up to 9/11. He goes to be a lawyer for Prince Bandar after he goes to work for a firm that was accused of insider trading on 9/11. So a lot of questionable activities by a lot of key people in the U.S. government who are responsible for keeping Americans safe. So I guess let's just kind of think through it here. What do you think's more likely? The official story that 19 hijackers, these uh, Islamic radicals with box cutters and pepper spray who couldn't even fly Cessnas. They evaded the multi-billion-dollar U.S. intelligence apparatus. They hated America because of our freedoms. That was the popular narrative of why this was done to us. And they did this to benefit the Middle East and help the Arab people. Well, I think we all know that the Middle East did not benefit from this. The amount of anti-Arab, anti-Muslim sentiment went through the roof after 9/11. Afghanistan's been in shambles for years. We killed over 1 million people in Iraq. This basically led to the domino effect of, the fall of Somalia, Sudan, Libya, and now I'd argue, seeing the ripple effect of it in Iran. Okay, so those 19 guys did it to benefit the Middle East, or an alternative narrative. A group of insiders took control of U.S. national air defenses and securely executed um, this operation using private continuity of government communication channels. Insiders directed the flow of military intelligence and explicitly ordered the stand down of interception responses to the hijacked aircraft. And what's more likely that you know uh, these 19 radical Islamic fundamentalists executed 9/11 for the benefit of the Middle East, or some insiders perpetrated 9/11 for unprecedented profits for transnational elites from both the intelligence community and corporate community. I don't know. I'm just asking the questions, but I think they're valid questions after considering some of these things we've discussed in the book. And I'm sorry, I kind of left, I forgot to pop ahead to this slide. So it just kind of talks about what I just went over. So that's really it. I think that this book report is important. I think 9/11 is just very important to me still because I believe that if we don't um, get justice and seek out the people who really orchestrated and executed this event, we risk these people doing the same thing again and sending us into perpetual war, bankrupting the country, killing millions of innocent civilians all over the world. And I don't want that to happen. I would like for all of us to live in as much peace as possible. And I think it's only achievable if we take an honest look at who perpetuated those events and prosecute them so that they're not in positions of power today, and we can put some better people in places of power so that we are making more progress as a whole and not spiraling to doomsday, for lack of a better expression. So that's my 2 cents. I hope that this encourages everybody to go take a look at Kevin Ryan's fabulously researched book. He does a much better job of making the case that we should consider this alternative theory of who done it as it relates to 9/11, and he presents much better evidence than just the little blurbs that I've provided here. So go take a look. Also, go consume the other books I mentioned. They help piece together the overall narrative in a really powerful way. And as always, stay well, and thanks for tuning in. Take care.